Hello, church. As promised, I wanted to start working through Nehemiah chapter 11 and chapter 12 during this week, as we had just finished Nehemiah 10 in our sermon series, and we will wrap up the entire sermon series in Nehemiah 13 on this coming Sunday, July the 6th. So this is what I call supplement one for Nehemiah 11. Let's go ahead and just simply read this scripture and that we're going to look at today, which is Nehemiah chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. So it says, "Now the leaders of the people settled in Jerusalem. The rest of the people cast lots to bring one out of every 10 of them to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while the remaining nine were to stay in their own towns. The people commended all who volunteered to live in Jerusalem." So there's a number of this is just two small verses, and there's three key things that are happening inside of this verse technically. First of all, in the first few words, we see that the leaders of the people settled in Jerusalem. So what we're seeing here is that the leaders themselves said, "Hey, now the walls are done. There's security. The temple is there and it's operating, and there's starting to become some business that's starting to operate within the city. So now all the leaders need to move into town. They need to show and be the first people to show up and move into town. And so these leaders have decided to do this on their own. And then all of the remaining people, it appears in the second part of verse 1 here that not everybody or there weren't even enough people that were willing to move into the city to help populate it, so they needed to cast lots. Now, before we go on with that concept, just remember back in Nehemiah 7:4, it says, "Now the city was large and spacious, but there were few people in it, and the houses had not yet been rebuilt." So keep in mind that that's what's happening here. The nobles have said, "All right, we've done all this work. We're coming in. We're going to move into the city to help, be leaders and show that they're moving in." And then the rest of the people are kind of like, "Nah, maybe not yet." And why would they say, "Yeah, maybe not yet"? Why would they have to cast lots? Well, there's a couple of different reasons why. Number one, keep in mind that the exiles had come back in multiple waves. The exiles came back in first wave with Zerubbabel, and then the second wave with Ezra. And the one with Ezra was about 15, 16, 17 years previous. And the one with Zerubbabel was even much, much more than that, almost 100 years, 80, 90 years time frame. So a lot of these families that had come back, a lot of these people that had come back had already settled in portions of the land. They were running farms, they were running businesses, or perhaps even living in other cities, their hometown cities. Remember, kind of like Jesus was born in Bethlehem because Mary and Joseph had to go there for the census because that's where their family came from. So things like that had gone on, and people are saying, "Hey, I don't want to uproot my entire life again, possibly for those people that came with Ezra, for the people that came with Nehemiah. I don't want to uproot my life again and now move into the city just to help populate it." And the other thing is that, we've talked about security it being an important piece. These people probably already had a sense of security. And in fact, a new walled Jerusalem actually probably was less of a secure environment for them. So they saw a risk in moving into that. Why would they see that? The new walls were up. It should provide security. Well, that's because those new walls, as we know from Nehemiah chapter 6 and chapter 8 and other periods, these walls were actually attracting attention, and these walls and the things that were going on there were attracting people to possibly attack the city, like Sanballat or Tobiah and the other surrounding towns. They now see it as strong. They now see it as a threat. So what's going to be attacked? It's not going to be the little farm that's 30 miles or 20 miles or 15 miles out of town, or even the next city down, because that city's established. It's going to be Jerusalem that's attacked. So moving in there produces a risk for their family, on top of uprooting them again, on top of potentially having to give up their farms or potentially give up their businesses. So moving into Jerusalem just because the walls were repaired was not something that was a desirable thing to do. So in order to populate the city, first of all, the leaders are moving in there, and second of all, they're going to cast lots to bring out one out of every 10 to live in Jerusalem. So the unlucky tenth, or one out of 10 that gets to move into Jerusalem there. And so, but we do see the positive side of it. We do see that while the remaining nine were to stay in their own towns, it goes on from there and says that that people are commended in verse 2 for all who volunteered to leave in Jerusalem, so or to live in Jerusalem. So there is a group of people that did stand up and say, not just the leaders, but there's a group of people that stood up and said, hey, you know what, I'll go ahead and move. I'll uproot my life. I'll start this over again. And so the lots were cast for the remaining number of people that needed to go into there. And what can we learn? That what can we learn from this in our lives today? And that's really kind of the point of going through these, is taking those history lessons, these spiritual, biblical history lessons, and say, how can we apply these to ourselves today? Well, first one, let me recommend that a spiritual and civic responsibility exists here. So what we're seeing is that leaders, they likely recognize the strategic and spiritual importance of Jerusalem, and the fact it was clearly identified that it's a holy city. So it's the center of worship, the center of administration. It's the identity for the Jewish people. And so the leaders recognized that it was their responsibility, their civic and spiritual responsibility, to come around that in which they have created, if you will, that which has been designated. And I think that's something that we should ask of our leaders in our churches, and not just with Palmer, but elsewhere. We have so many churches now where the leadership is not, sometimes not even in the same state, or the denominational type of scenarios where there's a hierarchy that might be in Kansas, for example, or in New Mexico or Utah, that's governing over the church. And we see this following through into the New Testament and how we model our church at Palmer Christian Church, where we have elders, and those elders are right there in our church. They are right there governing our church. There is no outside influence except for the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of Jesus, that is governing our church. So our leaders, Andrew and Lucas and Bryce, are already inside the city, if you will. They already moved inside the city. They've moved inside of our church. They're not continuing to worship at Anchorage, at Christian Church of Anchorage, or Community Christian Church in Eagle River. They are right here inside of our church and governing our church. So we already follow that, but that's kind of the model, if you will, that the leaders are following here. Another thing that we see here is voluntary sacrifice. So we see the entire population coming together and saying, hey, we're going to send 1/10 of our people to live in this city, to populate this city. And by the way, whoever wants to volunteer, they can do so. So they did. They didn't get enough people to voluntarily sacrifice to move in. So they cast lots. And there's no indication here that the people that took, drew that short straw, if you will, that they had any qualms about it, that they fought about it, or they didn't create disunity about that. So voluntary sacrifice is seen here as well. So unlike that general population who were chosen by lot, the leaders step forward, and then the volunteers step forward, and then the general population step forward. But there's a desire to serve, even in the people who drew the short straw, so to speak. There's a desire to serve. And it's not just merely an obligation, it is out of desire and voluntary sacrifice for the Lord, knowing that this is better that they populate that city. So we bring that down to today. What about taking a role of responsibility inside the church in order to help it go? Maybe you don't, maybe you're not the kind of person that really likes to work with the young kids, but going down to, on Sunday morning during worship service to help with the Wigglers, for example, is something that would help spread the wealth, if you will, spread the opportunities out. You could do that one time a month, and then that means that one time a month someone else who's had to go down there 2 or 3 times for a month can come up and worship. So these are the types of things we're asking people to do. And again, Palmer does this very well. But I still think that I would prod everyone, including myself, to just kind of think outside of the box. Where can I serve that I would be unlikely to serve in? Where would be a little bit of a sacrifice to me for me to do that? And then finally, we see a symbolic obedience and a dedication here by residing in Jerusalem. These leaders were dedicating themselves to the continued restoration of God's dwelling among His people. And so, these are the kinds of things that we want to see out of people in our church, and that we want to see. We want to see the leadership setting the example. We want to see everyone setting example for those that are outside of the church, so they can be attracted to come into the church. We want to see some people step up and think outside the box, or take responsibilities that are not normally their responsibilities, the harder assignments, if you will, like those that the lot fell on, if you will, the short straw fell on, in order to help the local church serve the people that needs to serve. And then we want to do so with that God honoring heart, the willing heart that is shown here. Again, these people didn't argue about drawing the short straw. They didn't complain about it. What they do, they said, okay, I'm going to go do it. I got to do this to make sure that in our case the church, or in their case the goal of Jerusalem and the temple being resurrected. I need to sacrifice myself in order for that to happen. So here's a couple of things I'd ask you to do, to think about. So ask yourself, where is God calling you to go serve, even if it's uncomfortable? Perhaps it's just down, like I said, downstairs with the Wigglers on Sunday morning, or maybe it's a Sunday school class, or maybe it's a mission field someplace. I would ask that question, to ask, have you answer that yourself, but also reflect. Do I only serve when it's convenient, or am I willing to serve when and where it's most needed? See, these people were willing to step in, not only when it's convenient to them, but in the location that's most needed, as well as the timing in which it was most needed. And then finally, of course, we always do. We want you to pray. God, give you a heart, give me a heart of a volunteer. Give me the heart, and give you the heart of someone who's willing to step up in those difficult situations, in those situations that are not as easy, for example, to handle. Maybe you're not a cook, but you can go down and help serve the food at different times, and so on and so forth. So allow God to give you that volunteer heart. All right, so that's the first two verses of chapter 11. Those are really key and significant verses. I promise you, we'll move a little faster as we move forward with this, but wanted to get those two out there and that important message. So we'll talk later. Thanks.